So in the last video, I took you through the symptoms that led up to our original diagnosis, which was on January 3rd of 2019. So a little over 2 years ago, we had our original diagnosis. 2 years and 2 months ago, we had our first diagnosis of JIA. Grayson's symptoms all easily led to this diagnosis, other than the fact that he was a little bit old to be diagnosed for the first time. Typically, kids are diagnosed with this at the age of 2, and then he was diagnosed at 6.5, so he was old. Grayson, by the way, has given me permission to talk about all of this stuff, and at some point, if he wants to, I will interview him as well and get his thoughts on the whole thing. So, in some cases of JIA, it's a minority of the cases. I actually don't know the percentages, but I'm thinking it's like 1/3 of cases or 20% of cases, something like that. They will also have an eye problem called uveitis, where there are membranes of the eyes that are experiencing an inflammation. So the membranes of the knees are experiencing an inflammation, and the membranes of the eyes. So it turns out that Grayson was one of the unlucky few that also had uveitis, which we ended up having a totally different treatment protocol, which was much trickier. Now, I will say, and so I'm actually going to make 2 videos, for one for the knee treatments and one for the eye treatments. But before I did, I sort of wanted to run us through how it is that we decided to do the treatments that we did. We treated both conditions aggressively, the knee problem and the uveitis in the eye. We basically went through the gamut of whatever was available to us that we could afford, that was at a level that we thought would appropriately address the situation. It did and does make his body ill. He does throw up on a regular basis for the medication. We have to get his liver enzymes checked every 3 months because the medications he's currently taking could potentially damage his liver. He has a complete aversion to pills at this point and actually prefers injections, which honestly was kind of a stroke of luck because the injections are better. And of course, the medications that we have him on suppress his immune system, which I don't mind telling you, when the pandemic came around, was a pretty frightening proposition. Those could be arguments made for not pursuing aggressive medication in the case of this particular autoimmune disease, or any autoimmune diseases. But the long-term ramifications of not aggressively treating these are also quite frightening. He could, for example, lack mobility in his legs over time. His legs could grow incorrectly. We had already seen somewhat of a difference in the length of his legs because one of his knees was much more inflamed than the other. There could be a permanent eversion of a permanent inversion of the legs, where one of them is kind of knock-kneed, I think is the word for it. You could also have a separation of the leg. You could actually have a separation of the capsule altogether. And so those are the movement problems. And of course, when the legs grow differently and you have different lengths of leg, this leads to lifelong ramifications such as knee problems, hip problems, back problems. And we didn't want to subject him to that. Perhaps more obviously with the eye problem with uveitis, when uveitis is left untreated, it does lead to blindness in many cases. At one point, he wanted to stop the medications that he was on, especially the ones for his eyes, because they made him so miserable, and we decided, his specialist and I basically overruled him, which I still think about that to this day, because the words that he used were, it's only one eye. At that time, only his left eye was inflamed. I think that particular doctor's visit really haunts me, because I want Grayson to have agency over his body. You know, I want him to be able to make his own decisions. But at the time, I think he was still 6 years old when he said those words, and he just simply didn't understand the long-term ramifications of this. You know, blindness. You would probably regret not having done something about it when you had the opportunity to do it. And the other side of it is that all the specialists were completely in agreement. When I had some questions about a new treatment protocol, I would get in touch with every specialist that I knew who knew something about this. I would ask them all the same questions, and they all said exactly the same answers. Like, yes, you have to use this particular medication if that is what is available to you. They tend to be really expensive. So if it's available to you and it's being recommended, you should be using it for sure. And that never happens. With my, decades of experience with physicians, I feel like if you ask the same question of multiple physicians, generally speaking, you'll get as many different answers as physicians that you ask. So the fact that they were all lockstep in the same exact unanimous support of these decisions, it was actually a pretty easy decision to make. That's sort of the Western view of why it is that we decided to pursue treatments aggressively, and why the child, spoiler alert, he's doing great. He actually is completely free of symptoms. For 1 whole year now, he's been free of symptoms. And so if we have the ability to keep him free of symptoms for 1 more year, we can actually go off of all the medications, which is grand news. The reason why we decided, I don't think I have to defend myself on this, but there are always some people who would suggest things like, I don't know, some naturopathic remedies, maybe changing his diet. These are already things that were suggested to us. So I can tell you that, anybody who suggests something like that doesn't know about this particular illness. There are some autoimmune conditions where a change of the diet probably could help. It's kind of sad that I have to be defending what we decided to do. I'm a relatively worldly person, and I do understand the philosophy behind naturopathic medicines. I'm not so naive to suggest that only Western medicine will do. I actually do look into the literature and find peer-reviewed papers that support the idea that certain spices and certain herbs actually do help with certain conditions. I mean, it's clearly true that can happen. I do have a personal philosophy that there are different illnesses and insults to the body that can actually be treated more naturopathically. And I don't believe in medicating everything, for sure. And part of that philosophy is in agreement with one of the projects that I do for my job. I am a college professor. I teach anatomy and physiology. So I'm teaching students who are going into healthcare fields. And I teach at a school at Carthage College in Kenosha, where many students are encouraged to go on these short-term study abroad programs, especially to a cultural experience that might challenge their worldview a bit. So given that, a few years ago, I developed a program where I would take students to India and study healthcare practices there, study how it is that the Indian people engage with healthcare. I'm no expert on this subject yet. I've only done this program twice, but the dozens of conversations that I've had, which will eventually be hundreds of conversations, for most Indian people, it is a balance between what we consider traditional and non-traditional treatments, protocols. There are some Indian people, to be fair, who will not go to a hospital or get injections or allow their children to get injections, for example. But I think broadly speaking, most of them will. If they have access to Western medicines, they will, in fact, engage with them. So many Indian people will go to a clinic, a hospital. They will get vaccines. They will get injections. If the child is very sick, they will take them to, Western style doctor. But combined with this, every single Indian person that I know also engages in healing, in aspects of healing that are outside of Western medical practices. Very typically, this would be Ayurvedic medicine or metallurgy or using herbs or spices that have healing properties, and yoga. Yoga is a big part of the culture, Yoga is actually taught as one of the subjects in school. So we've gone to a yoga studio where the yoga practices are very much like what we would view yoga as in the United States. And then there are other types of yoga as well. There is every single morning in Varanasi, there's a public yoga session, which a large number of people go to, and there will be a guy on the stage at the front, and we'll all do yoga together, and it's free, and they have these big yoga mats that are laid out, big long strips of yoga mats that are laid out for everybody to do this. So people are doing yoga everywhere. They're literally all day long on the banks of the Ganges River. That is the one aspect of holistic medicine that probably would have served Grayson very well. I personally think, based on many observations that I've made over the years, but also partially on what I teach and what I study, I think that movement is the most important thing that we do. It keeps everything healthier. If you can continue to move, it's good for your muscles, it's good for your bones, it's good for your circulation, for your heart. And so part of moving, this is ironic that my son had a problem with his joints, because I personally think that the joints are maybe the most important thing that you have in your body. Keeping your joints healthy is quite important. That ability to move your bones is dependent on your joints being healthy. So I actually think that Grayson would have benefited if we at that time had been participating in yoga as a family, and we'd been doing stretching exercises and making sure that he always had that mobility in his joints. That would have actually been really helpful. So despite the fact that I think yoga would have helped him quite a lot, I don't really think there's any other types of remedies out there that would be more natural, that would have actually cured his knee problem or his eye problem. This is such a tricky disease. The pathways by which the body decides to attack its own tissues is so hard to treat that, and I know not everybody completely understands. I don't completely understand exactly what happens with autoimmune disorders. I'm learning more all the time, of course, but there is no natural remedy that actually would have resolved the issue of his eyes, which long-term seems to be the most pervasive issue. Oligoarticular JIA is an episodic disorder, at least in our case. I'm not sure that it always is, but in our case it's episodic, which means symptoms come and go. That was probably true of his knee problem. As far as I know, uveitis is not episodic. Once an inflammatory event occurs in the eyes, and this uveitis occurs, it actually continues to get worse and worse over time, and the symptoms, as far as I know, the symptoms do not go back down to zero. And what you're really looking for is zero markers of inflammation in the eyes. And saffron won't do that. Yoga won't do that. This is something that if you want to have vision for the rest of your life, you have to go after it. There are multiple examples of people out there who had uveitis as children and are now only 40 years old. You know, like it wasn't that long ago that there simply wasn't any kind of treatment for uveitis, and people simply went blind. People who had JIA when they were young and are now 35 and 40 years old are now still having issues with their eyes, sometimes having to give up their careers because their eye issues were never resolved. The eyes are tricky to treat, especially uveitis in the eyes. You have to treat it. You have to treat it, or over time, your vision will degrade. That's kind of the inevitable outcome. So I'm grateful to live in a country and in a time where the medicines have become so developed that he literally can eventually go into remission of his condition. Super grateful that the pharmaceutical industry exists. I am grateful that we have the opportunity to be treated with medications that are actually resolving really difficult problems. I'm troubled when people who are in positions of influence will suggest that the pharmaceutical industry is a total evil. It just can't be true. And of course, this is the United States' emphasis on having a robust, healthy life and not accepting what happens to our bodies without a fight. If I were to look at the philosophy of Indians as a whole, one of the recurring themes that I found throughout the whole thing was that Indian people choose to wait. They allow time to do a lot of healing. And of course, during that interim time, oftentimes they're practicing yoga, they're going to temple, they're chanting, they have certain herbs in the foods that they're eating that have healing properties. So without thinking about it, Indian people oftentimes are healing themselves on a daily basis. The daily life of Indian people is all about healing the body and keeping it vital. I think about the healing of the body. I'm quite conscious of unfortunate side effects that Grayson has to go through because we have chosen for him to indulge in these medications. I do believe that he understands most of it. You know, he has a logical sense about his future and his life and so on. So it becomes difficult to explain complex health issues and ramifications to a person who does not have a medical background or very much scientific knowledge. Thankfully, Grayson is in a position where he simply trusts me. He also thinks that all of his specialists are smart, and he trusts us to make the right decision for him, even if at times he does object or he is so sick of it. I know that he's sick of it. But this is so that he can have the most robust, healthy body going forward, and that he can continue going to gymnastics, which he has started recently. Or that he will not have his career limited by immobility or by vision issues. So it's lucky that he doesn't fight too much against these treatment protocols, even in the cases that they are very unpleasant. So that is the philosophy behind what I'm going to be discussing in the next video and in the next video. Videos 3 and 4 are going to be based on treating his knees and then treating his eyes and how it is that we went about that.